Single mom was kidnapped by mistake. But Mafia boss said, "Wrong girl, but I'm keeping you anyway." The blindfold was pulled so tight that it bit into my temples and sent a sharp ache through my entire head. I could not move. My wrists were bound behind my back with plastic zip ties, the rigid edges cutting into my skin every time I tried to draw a breath. I lay on the icy metal floor of a moving van, the engine's steady vibration humming beneath me like some mechanical beast growling in the dark. The last thing I remembered was stepping out of the University of Oregon library in the city of Portland, my arms full of books for my thesis on Renaissance art. I had just opened my umbrella against the light drizzle when a hand seized me from behind, a damp cloth pressed over my nose and mouth. A sickly sweet scent flooded my lungs, dizzying and thick. Then everything went black. I had no idea how long I had been unconscious. Perhaps a few minutes, perhaps many hours. My phone was gone. The small watch I always wore had been taken. I had no way to tell time. The van jolted violently as it hit a rut, throwing my body into the air before slamming me back onto the metal floor that numbed my limbs with its cold. I held back a groan that almost escaped. If they believed I was still unconscious, maybe I would have a chance. A small one, but still a chance. Then I heard voices. Men. Their tones were low, quick, and urgent, but not speaking English. The rhythm was unmistakable. Spanish, spoken with a borderland accent. I had taken a few courses in the language, enough to catch scattered words drifting through the dark interior of the van. The target. The boss. She had better be worth it. The target. Worth it. Shock spread through me. I was just Hannah Monroe, a graduate student in art history. I lived on instant noodles and discount coffee from the campus cafeteria. My parents were retired in Idaho. There was nothing about me that anyone would want to kidnap. So what did they want from me? The van slowed, then swerved sharply. Gravel crackled under the tires. No more pavement. No more city. They were taking me somewhere remote. This was no longer Portland, perhaps the outer edge of Oregon, or farther still toward Montana. Wind seeped through a crack in the door, carrying the thick scent of damp earth and pine. I forced my breathing to stay slow and even. My heartbeat was pounding wildly, but I refused to panic. I knew that panic only sharpened mistakes. After what felt like a long and numbing journey, the van stopped. A door swung open. Cold air rushed in at once. A rough hand clamped around my arm and yanked me out, with none of the care that a man barked about in heavily accented English. "Be careful. The boss wants her intact." A tremor escaped my breath. They called me the target. They mentioned a boss. They said I had to be worth something. But I had no worth at all. I had no ties to wealth or crime. I was only a student drowning in a thesis. They were mistaken. They had to be. As they dragged me forward, my legs buckled, nearly collapsing under me. Freezing wind broke across my face through the blindfold, carrying the sharp scent of mountain pine. There was no longer any doubt. I had been taken to some remote wilderness. A heavy door creaked open and wind swept through it as if striking my skin. They pushed me inside. Wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet. Another door slammed behind me, and a lock clicked with a cold finality that echoed in the stillness. A deep voice rose in front of me, steady and commanding. "Take off the blindfold." In that instant, I knew the worst had not ended. It had only begun. One question filled my mind. Why me? And the most chilling answer came in another voice, speaking clear English. "Perhaps she is not Hannah Bellamy, but she is still Hannah, and that is enough for us to keep her." Understanding washed over me with a hollow thud. They had taken the wrong person, but they had no intention of correcting their mistake, and I had stumbled into an error that might reshape the rest of my life. If you've made it this far and feel yourself being pulled into a journey that's as breathless as it is deeply emotional, don't forget to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom channel so you won't miss the next gripping chapter. If you believe this story is worth sharing, go ahead and like the video and pass it along to others who love powerful storytelling with tension and emotional depth. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment below with your location so we can see just how far our story has reached. Every share, every comment from you is a source of motivation for us to keep bringing unexpected, heartfelt journeys that carry true human value. And now, we invite you to continue with the next part of the story. I raised my hands, fingers trembling as they brushed against the fabric of the blindfold. When I pulled it away, the light in the room stabbed at my eyes, sharp and blinding. It took several seconds before the scene before me began to take shape. The room I stood in was, to my shock, a study of unexpected elegance, lined with dark wood furniture, cold stone floors, towering bookshelves that reached the ceiling, and a large desk dominating the center of the space. Behind the desk sat a man, posture composed and upright, his coal-black eyes fixed intently on me. He looked to be in his early 40s, his skin sun-warmed, hair trimmed close, his jaw clean-shaven, though the sharpness of his features could not be softened. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms covered in ink, and his fingers bore heavy rings that looked less like ornaments and more like weapons. I stood frozen, my heart thundering in my chest as our eyes met. I didn't know who he was, but I understood, with absolute clarity, that this was the one in command. The man who decided what lived and what died in this place. He studied me the way someone might analyze a complex puzzle. "You're awake." His voice was low, smooth, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I fought to swallow the panic rising like bile in my throat. "Who are you people? Why did you take me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly rose from his chair, moving around the desk with a grace that was almost predatory. I saw the edge of a tattoo winding from his neck to his collarbone, the rest hidden beneath his shirt. When he stopped in front of me, the space between us vanished. I could smell the faint, haunting trace of magnolia cologne, woven with the metallic tang of gunpowder. "What's your name?" I hesitated. Such a simple question, yet it felt like a line drawn between life and death. What if I said the wrong thing? What would they do to me? Hannah Monroe. I'm a graduate student at the University of Oregon. I don't have money. I don't know anyone involved in crime or the Mafia. If this is a ransom, you've made a mistake. I'm just a student. I don't even have $100 in my bank account. Silence followed my words, long and heavy. The man tilted his head slightly, as if mentally verifying a list. "Dominic Callahan," he said. "I run this place, and it appears we've made a mistake." But instead of bringing relief, his words made my knees feel like they might give way. Dominic turned back to the desk, picked up a phone, tapped a few buttons. Minutes passed. Then his voice shifted, growing colder. "Hannah Monroe, 32 years old, graduate student in art history, no criminal record, no family ties to any known organizations, no connection to Bellamy." He looked up. "A big mistake. We meant to take Hannah Bellamy, only daughter of Charles Bellamy, the man who embezzled $3 million from the international art trade network I control. The plan was to use her as leverage. But apparently, my men only knew that the girl's name was Hannah, that she was a student, that she left the library at a predictable time. They followed orders, but they got the wrong girl. You." Dominic's eyes settled back on me. They no longer held the icy chill from earlier, but there was no warmth in them either. "You're not the one I wanted. But now you've seen too much. You've heard too much. And that is a problem." I stumbled backward, bumping into the back of a chair, breath shallow and ragged. I prayed I was dreaming, that this was just a nightmare. But Dominic remained where he stood, his gaze locked on me, as though weighing my fate with nothing more than a nod. No one spoke. The silence in that room was unbearable, and I realized then, with terrifying clarity, that my survival now rested in the hands of a man I had never met, inside a world I did not belong to. They had taken the wrong person. But I was still here, still held, and somehow that was more frightening than the mistake itself. Dominic stood still for a few long seconds, his black eyes fixed on me with a chill so piercing it raised the hairs along my spine. Then he exhaled, slowly, as if he had just arrived at a final conclusion about my presence in that room. "You shouldn't be here." The words slipped out of his mouth, light as air, yet heavier than any threat I had ever heard in my life. My throat burned dry. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it echoing inside my chest. If I wasn't supposed to be here, then what would they do to fix that mistake? Dominic stepped closer, only a few strides between us. My body instinctively backed away, but the solid weight of a wooden chair behind me stopped me cold. There was nowhere left to go. Dominic stopped just inches away, his eyes locked onto mine without blinking. "My men made a mistake. I made a mistake. But that doesn't change the fact that you've seen my face, and you know where this place is. In my world, that means I can't just let you walk out like nothing happened." His voice was calm, low, almost steady, with no edge of anger, no flare of rage, just a simple, unflinching statement of fact, and that made it all the more terrifying. It wasn't personal. It was protocol. A cold logic that left no room for mercy. I forced myself to breathe, forced the rising fear back down where it couldn't take over. "I won't say anything, I swear. I don't know who you are. I don't want to know. I just want to go home. Please, let me go. I'll pretend none of this ever happened." Dominic looked at me like he was weighing the worth of my words, measuring them against something I couldn't see. Do you know how many people have said that to me? He leaned in, just enough for his face to come within inches of mine, his voice almost a whisper. They all said they'd stay silent, and not one of them did. A tremor ran through me. I understood what he meant. No one left this place still posing a problem. Dominic turned back toward the desk, picked up a stack of papers and dropped them hard against the wood, the sudden crack of sound making me flinch. You know the name of the person I'm hunting. You know where this location is. You've seen how I operate. The moment you walk out that door, you become a threat, even if you don't mean to be. Even if you're innocent. He paused, and then added, softer, but somehow even more cutting in its truth. And you are innocent. That's what makes this even more of a problem. I stared at him, searching for some trace of humanity in his expression. But all I found was calculation. The cold, quiet calculation of a man who had long ago made peace with decisions that shattered other people's lives. Then he gave a nod. Just one. Ethan. Take her to a holding room. Keep her there until I decide what to do. The door behind me opened. The same man who had dragged me out of the van stepped into the room. Broad-shouldered, arms inked from wrist to elbow. His eyes weren't cruel, but they held no sympathy either. Just duty. I stepped back on instinct, but Ethan's hand gripped my arm. Firm enough to make resistance pointless, gentle enough not to hurt. I turned back to Dominic one last time, my voice cracking with desperation. You can't keep me here forever. I have a life. I have a family. Dominic remained behind the desk, unmoving. His gaze didn't waver. I know. That's what makes this dangerous. You're not supposed to be here, Hannah. But you are. And now you're my responsibility. A very complicated one. I was pulled out of the room before I could speak another word. The door closed behind me with a solid finality, and I felt the world seal shut. My future, locked tight inside a place I never belonged. And it was in that moment, with a clarity that stole the air from my lungs, that I understood. My fate now rested entirely in the hands of a man I had never met, who saw me not as a person but as a complication in a game I didn't know the rules to. And one thing was certain. I was never meant to be here. But still, I was. And that was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. Ethan led me down a long corridor lined with thick carpet, dark wooden walls, and the soft amber glow of vintage lamps. There were no windows, no markings, nothing that allowed me to guess where I was. Everything was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if the entire house had been severed from the world outside. I did not ask questions, and he offered none. His footsteps were steady and certain while I moved like a shadow beside him, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. At the end of the hallway, Ethan opened a heavy door. He did not shove me inside. He simply nodded. Go in. I stepped through. The room was lit and larger than I expected. A wide bed covered in clean white sheets, an old wooden wardrobe, a writing desk made of oak, and a velvet-covered chair placed beside a window. But the window did not open. I walked to it. Thick metal bars were fixed outside, solid and unmoving. I pressed against it lightly. Nothing shifted. High near the ceiling, a camera pointed directly at the bed. Across the room, a door led into a bathroom. I stepped inside and found a stone sink, a wall-mounted mirror, a shower, and a spotless toilet. No window, nothing sharp, nothing that could help me break a lock or defend myself. Every detail in the room had been deliberately arranged to hold me without chains or cuffs. When I stepped out, Ethan was still standing in the doorway, his gaze steady on me. My voice cracked as I asked, "How long?" Ethan shrugged, neither cruel nor gentle. "When the boss says you can leave, you leave. If not, then you do not." I looked at him, feeling as though I had been placed inside a beautiful but frozen cage that pressed the air from my chest. Ethan closed the door. The turn of the lock echoed like a verdict, swallowing me in its finality. I was imprisoned, locked away like a captive, even though nothing bound my hands and the room was as clean and quiet as a sanctuary stripped of mercy. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands gripping my head. My breath came fast, my chest tight as if an invisible weight pressed down on it. Everything had happened too quickly, too wildly. A day earlier, I had been arguing with my advisor over revisions to my thesis, worrying about printing costs and scholarship deadlines. Now I was somewhere in the mountains, trapped in an armed estate, held hostage by a man named Dominic Callahan. I did not know who he was in this world, but his reach clearly extended far beyond anything I could fathom. And I had nothing to bargain with. No one who knew where I was. No phone, no location signal, no trace leading back to me. I shot to my feet, pacing the room like a caged animal. I tried the main door. Locked. I pulled harder. Nothing. I knocked. No answer. I pounded with all my strength. Silence. Absolute silence. At last my hands fell and my back slid down the door. That was when the tears came. Not from pain, but from helplessness. I had been thrust into a world where rules no longer existed, where my survival depended entirely on the will of a stranger. One mistake, one wrong abduction. And now I was trapped in a room with no escape, inside a life I had never chosen. Beyond these walls there might be woods or mountains or armed men, but inside there was only me, my fear, and a future so dark I could not see the shape of it. I did not know how long I had been sitting against the door, only that my legs were numb, my eyes burned from crying, and the room remained still and silent, as if the world outside had vanished along with my freedom. It was only when the door swung open without warning that I startled and scrambled back on instinct. The person who entered was not Ethan. It was Dominic. He wore a white shirt, and he held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, and a thin file in the other. My file. His gaze swept across the room before settling on me. He set the coffee on the small table, but he kept the file. He tapped a finger on it. "I was going to solve my problem today," he said, his voice casual. You're the problem. You've seen too much." My blood ran cold. "But then I read this," he continued, pulling a printed paper from the file. "Your paper on Botticelli, the one cited over 100 times." He looked up, his eyes sharp with calculation. "It appears you have a very specific, very rare talent, and I have a need for that talent." I lifted my head, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "I mean I am offering you an arrangement. You work for me, temporarily. Assist me in evaluating collections, analyzing authenticity, providing expert insight. In return, you will not be treated as a prisoner. I will ensure safety, comfort, privacy to the extent that is possible." I stayed silent, my heart beating fast, not from fear but from confusion. He was asking me to become part of his operation. "You need me, yet I am a mistake." Dominic did not deny it. "You are a mistake, but you are a useful one. And I do not believe in wasting resources. You can help me, or..." I cut him off. "Or what if I refuse?" Dominic lifted his shoulders in a slow shrug. "Then you stay here. But without morning coffee, without a soft bed, without books. You will have 4 walls and time. And eventually, a person who is no longer useful becomes a problem I have to solve permanently." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. I studied him for a long moment, my mind racing. This wasn't a choice. It was a strategy for survival. If I stayed locked in that room, I was just a liability waiting to be erased. But if I worked for him, if I made myself valuable, I would see more, learn more. I would be near him. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way out. This wasn't acceptance. It was a new kind of fight. I had no choice. And he knew that. "Can I have books?" I asked, my voice rough. Dominic nodded. "I want real paintings, forgeries, documents, anything related to research. I want to keep my mind intact." Dominic rose to his feet with the controlled grace of a man who knew he always held the advantage. "I will have it arranged. We begin in the morning." He turned toward the door but paused before leaving. "And Hannah, do not think about running. This house is guarded day and night, and where we are is far enough from everything that you will not get far without being seen." Dominic walked out, the door closing gently behind him, though his warning thundered in my mind long after. I had just accepted an offer from the man who kidnapped me, not because I trusted him, but because I had no other way to survive. Sometimes survival is only an illusion of choice, but it was the only thing I had left. My first morning did not begin with the familiar sound of an alarm clock or sunlight pouring through the dormitory window, but with a soft knock at the door and a brief message from an unfamiliar woman. "After breakfast, Mr. Callahan would like to see you in the main library." I walked into the room they called a library, though in truth it felt more like a private museum than a place to read. The walls soared high, lined from floor to ceiling with rare books. The lighting was carefully curated, soft and intentional, casting gentle shadows between shelves. Paintings were interspersed among the volumes, not as decoration but as curated pieces, each one displayed with purpose. Dominic stood near one of the tall wooden shelves, holding a magnifying glass, closely inspecting a medium-sized oil painting. Without looking up, he gestured for me to come closer. I stopped a few steps away, uncertain what he expected, when he spoke. "What do you see in this painting?" No mention of the artist, no background, no hints, just a quiet demand for evaluation. I stepped nearer. The painting depicted a woman seated beneath an olive tree. The light fell across her in a way reminiscent of 17th century Italian technique, with a warm palette and soft, flowing brushstrokes. But something felt off. I frowned. First, the composition. The shadow of the central figure didn't align with the direction of the light. Then, the contour of the collar too uniform, no depth from fabric layering. And the most telling detail, the ground layer of paint lacked craquelure, the fine cracking that naturally occurs over time in old canvases. I looked up. It's a replica. Skillfully done, but 20th century work. Dominic studied me for a moment, then nodded. Correct. He returned to the desk and began laying out a series of documents, replicas, infrared scans, forged certificates, and shipment records. I recognized many of the paintings as famous pieces, though listed under false names, sourced from questionable auction houses in Eastern Europe. Dominic explained without waiting for questions. I run a private network for art authentication. Some collectors want to know if what they're buying is real or not, but they prefer to remain invisible. I provide that service. Inside me, something began to twist. A part of me wanted to shout that this was laundering, plain and simple, but another part, still clinging to reason, recognized what Dominic was really offering. A way to survive. I began working in that library every day, analyzing pigments, examining strokes, researching provenance. Dominic never hovered. He appeared now and then, asked concise questions. His approach reminded me less of a criminal overlord and more of someone with an instinctive grasp of the industry. He knew where to press for doubts, which documents mattered, what details to confirm, and strangely, through these quiet exchanges, I began to glimpse a different side of him. Not the kidnapper, not the cold-eyed figure of control, but a man with a sharp mind, grounded in real knowledge, and perhaps even a genuine reverence for the art itself. One evening, as I was making notes on a possibly forged portrait, Dominic walked in holding 2 glasses of red wine. I didn't react to the gesture itself, but to the look in his eyes as he studied the painting. Have you ever wondered, if a forgery is done so well that it moves you, does it still matter that it's fake? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. It wasn't a simple question. It was the question of someone who had spent too long walking the line between real and false, right and wrong, in a world where those distinctions blur under the weight of power, money, and survival. I didn't know how deep I had already stepped, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Dominic was no longer just the man who had kidnapped me. He was pulling me slowly into a world where the boundary between art and crime was as thin and fragile as a single layer of oil paint. And for reasons I could not name, I was still walking forward. I no longer remembered how much time had passed since that first day I agreed to work with Dominic in the library. Perhaps it had been a few weeks, perhaps more than a month. Each day blurred into the next. I would wake, eat breakfast in silence, then spend hours surrounded by paintings, documents, certificates, and appraisal reports. Dominic's presence remained irregular, sometimes bringing in a new painting for review, sometimes standing quietly behind me for a few minutes, saying nothing, then leaving without a word. And then, that afternoon, everything changed. Dominic entered the library without warning, his face unusually tense. He placed a laptop on the desk in front of me, flipped open the screen, and pulled up a chair to sit across from me. Before I could ask anything, the image appeared. A face, a girl. Brown eyes, shoulder-length curls, features sharper than mine, but there was something about her that stirred an eerie sense of familiarity. Her name is Hannah Bellamy, Dominic said, his voice flat. This is the girl I was supposed to take. I froze. She had gone to the same university as I did. I had seen her once or twice in the library, but we had never spoken. She belonged to the circle of students who arrived in private cars, always surrounded by friends. I was the girl tucked away in the research wing, nose deep in dusty pages and journal articles. Dominic stared at the screen, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk. My men followed the wrong target. Same name, same time frame, same campus. They took you instead of her. I didn't know how to react. The truth should have brought relief, but instead, I felt a cold current rush down my spine. So you found her now? Dominic nodded. Yes, she's at another facility, safe. She'll be brought here soon. I looked at him, and something unexpected twisted inside me. Jealousy. Not because Dominic cared for her, but because I knew that from the moment she stepped into this house, my place would shift. I would no longer be the only anomaly in his plan. Dominic seemed to read it in my expression. You won't be forgotten. You're still part of my strategy. I tried to steady my voice. What strategy? What are you planning to do with both of us? He didn't respond right away. He stood, walked toward the bookshelf, as if to avoid my eyes. Then he turned, speaking slowly. I need leverage. One Hannah isn't enough, but two of you will make Charles Bellamy listen. I went still. He was talking about turning us into pawns in a larger exchange. Dominic looked at me as if this was nothing more than logistics. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm just putting the right pieces in the right places. I clenched my hands, the weight of it pressing down like stone. I was no longer a mistake. I was now a part of the plan. And that made me feel no safer. In fact, it made me feel more expendable than ever. I was being drawn into a game I didn't know the rules to, and Dominic was always one move ahead. I returned to my room, my chest heavy, my thoughts spiraling. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the girl named Hannah Bellamy, somewhere in this same house. Same name, same school, two lives that had never crossed until now bound together in an unfolding plot that neither of us could control. And I knew then, with a kind of aching clarity, that nothing from this point on would be accidental. I had become part of Dominic Callahan's hand, and when a man like him begins to calculate in terms of people, anyone can be sacrificed, including me. I woke to the sound of rain that had begun sometime after midnight and had not eased since. The sky was a heavy sheet of gray, pressing down on the villa and everything around it. A strange unease settled in me before I even opened my eyes. The room was as quiet as always, yet the air felt charged in a way that made the back of my neck tighten. When I stepped out into the hallway, 2 guards were standing on either side of the door. They said nothing, didn't gesture, simply watched me as though I were no longer the invisible presence I had been all these weeks but had suddenly become a crucial piece of a plan I was not allowed to understand. Dominic didn't appear all morning. I asked Olivia, the only person in the house whose presence felt even remotely human, but she only shook her head. No one knows where he is. No one is supposed to ask. I returned to the library, but my eyes skimmed the paintings without seeing them. My ears strained at every footstep that passed through the corridor. Near noon, Olivia entered carrying a coat and a small bag. She set them on the table in front of me. You need to get ready. Dominic wants you to come with him. I stared at her, unable to understand. Go where? Do what? She didn't answer, only turned away, though worry flickered clearly in her eyes. The car left minutes later. I sat in the back seat with Dominic beside me, his gaze fixed on the window streaked with rain. Ethan and 2 other men rode in front, each armed beneath dark jackets. No one spoke during the long drive. I had no idea where we were going, but I knew with absolute certainty that this was no simple errand. When the car turned down a narrow road through a thinning forest, Dominic finally spoke. This will be quick. We exchange Hannah Bellamy for information on her father's accounts and location. After that, she goes free. And me? I asked, my voice so low I barely recognized it. Dominic was quiet for a moment. If everything goes as planned, you come back with us. I said nothing. What he didn't say was clearer than what he did. If things did not go as planned, I would vanish into the rain and the trees, another forgotten mistake. We arrived at an abandoned warehouse at the edge of an old town just as the rain thickened to heavy sheets. Dominic stepped out first, scanning the area with the practiced caution of someone who knew exactly how quickly a moment could turn deadly. I followed, unrestrained, yet with no path of escape. Inside the warehouse, Hannah Bellamy sat in another vehicle with 2 guards. She looked exhausted, pale, but alert. When her eyes met mine, there was a flicker of surprise, then nothing. I could not blame her. There was no explaining any of this. Dominic stepped forward to speak with a stranger who seemed to be the intermediary. Papers were examined. A small USB drive was handed over. I saw Dominic's expression shift, his brow tense, and he glanced sharply at Ethan. Some signal passed between them. But before anyone could move, a gunshot cracked through the air. Then another. Then another. The room erupted into chaos. Someone shoved me hard and I crashed to the floor, my head striking the corner of an old wooden table. My vision blurred. Voices shouted. Metal clattered. Tires screeched across wet concrete. When I lifted my head, warm blood sliding down my forehead, I saw Dominic lying on his side across the warehouse floor, one hand pressed to his chest. Ethan was shouting, firing, pulling me upright all at once. They ambushed us. Move. Now. I was dragged out of the warehouse into the storm, pushed into the back seat of a different car. A stranger took the wheel. Ethan climbed into the front. I collapsed against the back seat, gasping for breath. Where is Dominic? I yelled. No one answered. The car sped into the rain. turning down a forest road that didn't exist on any map. I had no idea where we were headed. I only knew one thing with a clarity that startled me. Dominic had been shot. And for the first time since being taken into his world, a strange, unwelcome emotion rose sharp and undeniable inside me. Not just fear, concern. For him, the man I should have hated. The man who had torn me from my life. But in that moment, amid the chaos and blood and thunder of the storm, I found myself whispering a silent hope that he was still alive, and I could not understand why. The cabin in the woods felt like it had been built for a day exactly like this. There was no phone signal, no internet, and no one in the world who knew where we were. Ethan threw a backpack onto the table, motioned for me to sit near the fireplace, then went to check the perimeter. His eyes were dark, his face streaked with rain and mud, but every movement was sharp and deliberate. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop shaking. My head throbbed from the fall, dried blood clung to my temple, and my mind was hollowed out by the weight of what I didn't know. Dominic had gone down. I hadn't seen him pulled from the warehouse. I didn't know if he was alive or dead. No word had come. No one spoke, and the silence made the fear inside me swell like a balloon with nowhere left to expand. That entire night, I didn't sleep. Ethan sat at the window, his hand never straying far from the weapon at his side. He didn't speak, not once, sipping cold coffee and staring out into the thick darkness that swallowed the trees. Sometime before dawn, when exhaustion finally overtook me for a fleeting moment, the door burst open. Ethan sprang to his feet, gun drawn, but then froze. I jerked awake, and it was Dominic who stepped through, soaked to the skin. His shirt rumpled and torn, the sleeve wrapped roughly around his chest to slow the bleeding. His face pale with blood loss, but his eyes were unchanged, steady, strong, as if he hadn't just walked through fire. I stood without thinking, instinct pulling me forward, but I stopped just a few steps away. Dominic looked at me like he was surprised I was even still here. "I thought you would have left." His voice was hoarse. I couldn't speak. In that moment, I hadn't been thinking at all. I had just been scared. Scared that he hadn't made it. Dominic nodded faintly, then staggered, his knees softening beneath him. Ethan rushed forward with a curse, but his hands were quick, catching him before he fell, guiding him into the chair, inspecting the wound with a grim efficiency. The bullet had grazed his shoulder. There had been a lot of blood, but it wasn't fatal. Dominic clenched his jaw through the pain, his gaze never leaving me as Ethan bandaged the injury. Later, I brought him a cup of water. He took it, but didn't drink. He just looked at me for a long time. "You didn't have to stay. You could have run when everything went to hell." I nodded. "I know, but I didn't." Dominic set the glass down. "What happened?" My voice was barely a whisper. "At the warehouse, the other Hannah, Bellamy." Dominic's jaw tightened. "The ambush wasn't for us. It was for her." Ethan, who was cleaning his weapon by the fireplace, spoke without looking up. "It was Bellamy's father, Charles. He staged a rescue. Our intel was bad. He was waiting for the exchange. He got his daughter back." "So she's safe?" I asked. "Safe from us," Dominic corrected, his voice flat. "But now her father knows my face. He knows I took her. It's not over. He just escalated everything." He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly, every breath laced with the weight of something unspoken. "Then from now on, you'll be protected. Not because you're my asset. Not because you're part of my plan. But because I owe you that. You were dragged into this because of a mistake I made. And now I can't let you face it alone." For the first time since I had met Dominic Callahan, he wasn't giving orders. He wasn't hiding behind power or control. He was just a man. Wounded, exhausted, looking at me with quiet eyes that seemed to be confessing something even he hadn't expected to say out loud. I didn't know what I felt in that moment. It wasn't trust. Not yet. And it wasn't forgiveness. But it was something close to surrender. Not to him, but to myself, to whatever had begun shifting inside me. I nodded. "Then if you're going to protect me, I need the truth. No more secrets. No more lies." Dominic didn't look surprised. He gave a quiet nod, then closed his eyes, as if bracing himself for the one thing he had never prepared to give, truth. And in that cold cabin, buried deep in the forest, I realized the boundary between us had changed. We were no longer the captor and the captive. We were something else entirely, standing together in a gray space, drawn there by mistakes, held there by circumstance, and searching both of us for a way out of the dark, together. We left the cabin after 3 days. Dominic hadn't fully recovered, but he was steady enough to walk on his own. Ethan packed everything with the precision of someone trained to erase all traces, as if no one had ever lived there. A black SUV waited for us at the edge of the forest, winding through empty outskirts before merging onto a highway heading east. I didn't ask where we were going. Dominic didn't offer to explain. But when the skyline began to emerge from the haze like a memory returning too soon, I knew we were heading back to the place he called the Old World, New York, the city of art, money, power, and masks. The apartment was on the top floor of a modern high-rise in Tribeca, all clean lines and costly restraint. Glass walls offered an uninterrupted view of the city, its lights casting reflections onto polished wooden floors that gleamed like a gallery but felt just as cold. Olivia was already waiting in the living room. She embraced Dominic, checked the dressing on his wound, then turned to me. No smile, no greeting, just a clear, unblinking look. We have work to do. I was given a private room, fully furnished. No more cameras, no more digital locks, but no freedom either. Dominic wasn't holding me prisoner anymore, at least not in name, but I knew I wasn't going anywhere without someone watching. 2 men in plain clothes stood outside the apartment at all hours. Each time I stepped into the hallway, I could feel eyes following me. Whatever freedom I had now was little more than a well-decorated illusion. Dominic said it was for my protection. I wasn't sure if I believed him. Work began the very next day. Dominic assigned me to the Callahan Gallery, managed by Olivia, in the role of an art authentication specialist. I was given an office, access to databases, and even invited into meetings with collectors. My name appeared on the staff board, labeled as an independent consultant. To the outside world, I was a hired expert, but within the system, I was still the girl who had seen too much, and I began to understand the rules of this world. It ran on silence. No one asked too much. No one gave too much. Transactions moved like clockwork, flawless, clean, perfectly legal. But I saw something else. I saw works appear and vanish with no record. I saw forgeries leave the storage facility hours before authorities could intervene. I saw Olivia meeting with people who never showed up on schedules or calendars. I did the work. I kept my head down, but I remembered everything. Dominic came around less often. When he did, he looked tired, and there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. We didn't talk about Montana. We didn't talk about the warehouse, the bullets, or why I was still here. But something had changed. When our eyes met, neither of us looked away. There was a quiet pull between us now, something fragile but growing, a thread spun between 2 lives that had collided by accident, but were now bound by something more than circumstance. One night, standing alone on the balcony, I looked down at the endless stream of headlights rushing through the veins of the city. New York glittered below, loud, luminous, magnificent, but I didn't feel free. I felt like I was standing in a more beautiful cage. Higher, shinier, more expensive, but still a cage, and I knew then, if I ever wanted to escape it, Dominic wouldn't be the one to open the door. I'd have to find the key myself. The question was, did I still want to leave? Or had I already started choosing to stay without daring to admit it? The Callahan Gallery sat quietly on a narrow street in Soho, tucked between luxury fashion boutiques and vintage cafes, its presence discreet yet deliberate. Every morning, I stepped through the thick glass doors, etched with the gallery's name in slender silver letters, into a bright space of white walls, polished wooden floors, and the faint, lingering scent of oil paint hanging in the air. People liked to say that art was a form of redemption, a purification of the soul in a world unraveling at the seams. But to me, this gallery felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully constructed vault, one that held not just masterpieces, but shadows of the past, of ambition, of secrets I was beginning to realize I'd been pulled into deeper than I ever intended. Olivia was the one running it all, sharp, composed, impenetrable. Under her hand, the gallery operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine. I learned to track shipments pieces arriving from Europe, from Asia, from storage facilities so private they barely existed on paper. I learned to spot altered records, expertly revised certificates, paintings quietly renamed, reassigned, and relocated. Yet everything wore a mask of elegance. Patrons came and marveled, bought, gifted, bid. No one ever asked a question that stepped beyond the frame. I continued working. I continued staying quiet, but Olivia began to notice. One afternoon, when the gallery had emptied and the halls were quiet, she entered my office unannounced. In her hands, a thick folder. She sat across from me and studied me not with hostility, but with a certain detached interest, like a conservator examining the surface of a painting for the first sign of decay. What are you looking for in those archive files? I met her gaze, just trying to understand how things work. She gave a faint smile and placed the folder on the desk. Dominic says you're smart, but being smart doesn't mean you should know everything. I said nothing. Olivia opened the folder and drew out a faded black and white photograph. Blurry, aged, but I recognized him instantly. Dominic. Younger, without the wear behind his eyes. Beside him stood a woman with long hair and a gentle smile. My mother, Olivia said quietly. She died when Dominic was still a teenager, caught in the crossfire of a negotiation between two rival groups. Dominic witnessed the whole thing. Since then, every choice he's made has revolved around one thing: never letting anyone he cares about be pulled into that world again. I sat frozen, eyes locked on the photograph. Olivia slid it back into the folder, then continued. Dominic didn't build this gallery to launder money. That came later. He built it to escape, to create something clean. But the world doesn't let people leave. It always finds a way to pull them back. My throat tightened. So what about me? What am I in all of this? Olivia held my gaze for a long, measured moment, then slowly shook her head. You're the first person Dominic brought in for no gain, and the first person to make him break his own rules. I didn't know how to respond. In the silence that followed, the paintings on the walls seemed to watch us still, exquisite, indifferent. When Olivia left, I remained alone in the whitewashed room, the light from the skylight spilling over gilt frames and expertly rendered brushstrokes. I thought about her words, about Dominic's past, about the cabin in the woods, about the look in his eyes the day he thought I had left. I didn't know where I stood in their world, but I knew this. In this gallery, every artwork held two stories, one to display and one to hide. And somehow, I had become part of that hidden story. The second painting, the one never meant for the wall. I was going over the catalog of paintings in the archive when the internal phone rang. The receptionist's voice came through, light but edged with urgency. There are 2 men asking to see you. No appointment. But they said, they're from the bureau. I froze. My throat went dry. The pen in my hand stiffened into something foreign and heavy. When I stepped into the gallery's reception area, they were already there, 2 men in black suits, standing still beneath the soft lights and framed art. One was tall, graying at the temples, with a sharp, direct gaze. The other was younger, quieter, eyes scanning every inch of the room like a camera taking in evidence. The older man held out a badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need a moment with you, Miss Monroe. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I had no choice. They took me to a small cafe just a few blocks away. No handcuffs, no threats. But the tension was suffocating, as if every word I might say was already weighed and judged before it left my lips. We know you're not a criminal. The older agent spoke first, his tone gentle, almost like comfort. But you're very close to someone we've been investigating for nearly 3 years. Dominic Callahan. My hands clenched against the armrests. I didn't deny it, didn't defend him. I said nothing. He's not just a gallery director. He's connected to several international laundering networks, illicit cross-border deals. And recently, there's evidence linking him to at least 2 violent orchestrations. Do you know anything about these activities? I shook my head. I just work at the gallery. I assess paintings. I write reports. I don't touch any of that. The younger man opened a bag and pulled out a file. He slid it across the table to me. These are photos of you. From Montana. Inside the SUV, at the cabin, even leaving the warehouse where the shooting took place. You were there. And you are one of only 2 confirmed survivors. My voice came out hoarse. I wasn't there willingly. It was a mistake. At first. But after that, I don't know anymore. The older agent nodded slowly. We don't dispute that. And we understand. But because you were inside because you saw what no one else has, you're in a position to help. We don't want to arrest you. We want you to cooperate. Become a source. Someone on the inside. At first, just observe. But eventually, you may be a key witness. I don't remember exactly how I left that cafe. Only the sound of my own footsteps on the cold sidewalk. The noise of traffic around me echoing like a world I no longer belonged to. When I returned to the gallery, Olivia was already at the back door, waiting. She didn't ask anything. She just looked at me for a long moment. They found you. I nodded. Does Dominic know? She shook her head. Not yet. But if you're thinking of hiding it, don't. He always knows. I didn't respond. That night, I went back to the penthouse above the city, where every window looked out on a world of flickering lights and distant lives. Dominic wasn't home. I stood by the glass, staring out at the skyline, thinking of all the things I'd seen, all the truths I now carried. I was no longer the girl who'd been kidnapped by mistake. I was no longer a stranger stumbling through this world. I was someone holding a secret that could bring everything down. And if I kept it, it might drown me. When the door opened behind me and I heard Dominic's footsteps cross the silence, I didn't turn around. But I knew. Tonight, I would have to choose. There was no more middle ground. Dominic stood at the threshold for a long time before he stepped inside. He didn't ask what I was thinking, didn't try to read the expression on my face. He simply walked to the kitchen counter, poured 2 glasses of water, and set one down in front of me. Silence stretched across the apartment, thick and unbroken, as if even the world outside had paused to listen. I sat by the window, hands resting on my lap, my thoughts tangled in 1,000 threads I couldn't name. Dominic took the seat across from me. His gaze no longer held the icy control I had first seen in that cabin deep in the forest. Now, there was something quieter, worn, as if he too was carrying a war that never truly ended. "They've come to you, haven't they?" His voice was low and rough, but not surprised. I nodded slowly. "They have photos. They know I was in Montana. They know I work at the gallery, and they want me to cooperate." Dominic didn't ask what I had told them. He didn't rush to defend himself. He leaned back, brushing his hand across his jaw as if weighing something heavy. "You can leave," he said. "If that's what you want, tonight. I can get you new documents, a clean passport, a name that doesn't exist yet. You'll disappear. No one will find you. Not them. Not me." I looked up at him. A part of me had been waiting for those words for a long time. An exit. A release. But now, hearing them, they no longer meant what they used to. I don't want to run. If I'm still here, it's not because I'm afraid of the FBI, and it's not because I'm afraid of you. I just need to know one thing. From now on, I won't live like someone under control. I'm not a prisoner anymore. Dominic studied me for a long moment. His gaze shifted from caution to consideration, then to something that looked almost like respect. He set his glass down, leaned forward on his elbows, and nodded. "You're right. You're not a prisoner, and I don't want to keep you as one anymore. But if you stay, things change. No more pretending. No more halfway truths. I'll show you everything. Even the parts I've never told anyone." I drew in a long breath. "You kidnapped me because of a mistake, then kept me because you thought I was a risk. What about now? Why are you still holding me here?" Dominic didn't look away. He answered plainly, "Because I don't want to hide you anymore. Not because of a plan, not because you know too much, but because I need you here." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't romantic or dramatic. But in the quiet weight of those words, something shifted inside me, pulled by a gravity that logic could no longer resist. I stood and walked slowly to the window. Below us, the city glowed in restless motion, cars threading through streets like veins, neon casting reflections off steel and glass. A world constantly moving, full of danger, yes, but also full of the possibility of change. I turned back to him. "If I stay, everything has to be clear. No more lies. No more moves behind closed doors. And I won't stay silent forever. There will come a time when I have to speak the truth, even if it destroys everything." Dominic stepped toward me, not touching, but close enough that I could hear his breath. He didn't make a promise. He didn't need to. Because I knew, in that moment, neither of us was performing anymore. I was no longer Dominic's prisoner, and Dominic was no longer captive to the past that had forged him. We had stepped into a new agreement, one not bound by documents or conditions, but by choice, voluntary. And if anything was keeping me here now, it was no longer fear. It was hope. Hope that somewhere beneath the secrets and the shadows, there was still a place for truth, and for a second chance. Since that night, everything began to move to a different rhythm. There were no more unfinished questions, no more cautious glances traded in passing. Dominic changed not in some sudden, dramatic way, but like the quiet retreat of water from a riverbed, like shadows slowly giving way to light. He started handing over the reins of his side operations. Ethan no longer appeared as often as before. In his place came new people, real professionals, from real companies, with verifiable records and business plans reviewed down to the last detail. I didn't ask how Dominic managed it, and he didn't offer explanations. But I noticed the small signs. He spent more time at the gallery, not just as a figurehead, but in meetings with artists, investing in exhibitions with genuine academic value. Olivia's demeanor shifted too. She began including me in decision-making, allowing me to co-sign approvals for shipments, to put my name on reports sent overseas. She never said it outright, but I understood this was her way of acknowledging that I had become a real part of their world. Not because I was trapped in it, but because I chose to stay. What existed between Dominic and me didn't unfold like some predictable romance. We kept our distance in public, maintained professionalism when others were near, but in private, the quiet between us had changed. It no longer felt like silence. It felt like space-safe, unspoken understanding. One evening, as I was gathering my things in the gallery office, Dominic appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a long time, saying nothing, then spoke in a voice low and measured. "You made your choice a long time ago, didn't you?" I nodded. There was no need to explain it. Dominic walked forward and placed a small box on the table. Inside were a bank card, documents transferring partial ownership of the gallery, and a full set of legal papers under my name. "You don't have to be behind the curtain anymore. If you've really chosen to stay, then stay as someone who has a voice." I looked at what he had given me, then looked up at him. "I won't do this alone. If this life is the one I'm choosing, then the person beside me has to choose it too. Fully. You have to let go of what needs letting go. Not because you're forced to, but because you want a life that doesn't look over its shoulder." He said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded, and in his eyes I saw not hesitation, but clarity. That sentence wasn't a promise made to please me. It was the result of everything we had endured, every collision, every decision, every silence, every cost. I placed my hand over the contract, then met his gaze without flinching. Then we start over. No more fear, no more hiding. Dominic smiled a rare smile, untouched by calculation. He nodded. "We start from here." And just like that, from two people adrift in a world of power and lies, we began building something no one expected to survive. Something fragile, something real. A choice not born from the past, but made for the future. Autumn passed faster than I expected. The air in New York had begun to sharpen, just enough to pull jackets closer to skin. The trees in the park turned a brilliant gold before shedding their leaves one by one, as if the city itself had decided to learn how to slow down. At the gallery, we entered the busiest season of the year. An ambitious exhibition was on the horizon, one curated by me and Olivia together. Everything, it seemed, had finally found its rhythm. Dominic kept his promise. The shadows of his past dealings no longer lingered in the corners of meetings. Instead, there were business dinners with real collectors, phone calls about investment proposals, and legal frameworks that were beginning to take shape around him. He didn't just play the role of a reformed man, he was building something new. And for the first time, I began to believe in the life we were living. A life not defined by secrets, not punctuated by the sound of a knock on the door that could undo everything. But peace, I was learning, is never free. One evening, after returning from a museum launch party, Dominic received a call. He stepped out to the balcony to answer it while I changed clothes and started making tea. When I returned, he was still standing there, eyes fixed on something distant, but his expression held a stillness I hadn't seen in months. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. He didn't turn. "He's out," Dominic said softly, just loud enough for me to hear. "Who?" I asked, though a quiet dread had already begun to knot in my chest. "Andre Navarro." Dominic turned to face me, his voice calm but his eyes tightened at the edges. One of the men who had once done business with the Callahan family. A man Dominic had severed ties with years ago, when he discovered Navarro's involvement in illegal arms trading. Now he was free release due to lack of evidence, and he wanted to meet. I sat down, trying to steady myself. Dominic didn't speak further. He didn't need to. People like Navarro didn't come back just to shake hands. Dominic didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found him in his study. His phone powered off, his laptop shut. Before him lay an old manila envelope. Inside, documents from years past, contracts, notes, numbers, signatures, the sort of history that had long ago stopped being just ink on paper. Dominic knew what it meant. If he sat across from Navarro again, he couldn't keep the promises he'd made to me, to himself, to this new life. But if he refused, Navarro would not walk away quietly. This wasn't about whether to say yes or no. It was about what would be lost no matter the choice. I didn't speak for 2 days. I watched. I listened. I felt the subtle shifts in the current. Until the third night, I walked into his office without knocking. "If you think you can protect everything by sacrificing your word, you're wrong. If you sit down with Navarro, even once, everything we've built will fall apart." Dominic looked up at me. His eyes were tired, but the light was still there. "What do you think I should do?" I met his gaze. "Keep your promise. Don't negotiate. Don't bend. If Navarro wants a war, then we fight our way through the law." He let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. You think the law is on the side of people like me. No, I stepped closer. But I am. And if you believe another path is possible, then let me walk it with you. He said nothing more. But that night, he sent Navarro a message. Just one line. No negotiation. No reunion. We knew it wouldn't end quietly. But for the first time, Dominic didn't retreat to survive. He stood firm to protect what we had built together. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. The peace we held wasn't a gift. It was the result of every brave choice we dared to make. Choices that carried danger but also something even more powerful. Hope. One early morning in mid-November, I woke to the pale sunlight slipping through the curtain slats. Dominic was still asleep, his breathing steady and light, one arm draped across me as if, even in sleep, he couldn't bear the thought of letting me go. The apartment was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. No alarms, no unexpected calls, no one knocking at the door. But deep down, I knew our love had never truly lived in the light. It was born in shadows, forged between impossible choices and the constant edge of danger. Dominic was never easy to love. He wasn't gentle in the way fairy tales teach us to want. He didn't speak in sweet promises. He carried the contradictions of a man who had lived too long in darkness, desperate to believe in something, yet afraid he might lose everything if he ever opened his heart too far. And yet, it was that imperfection that made me stay. We didn't need to say "I love you" every day. We spoke in other languages. In the way Dominic would quietly make me tea on nights I came home too tired to move. In the way his eyes found me across the room at a gallery event, soft and steady. In the way I placed my hand on his shoulder when I could feel the storm starting to rise inside him. There were nights we lay side by side, both awake, not touching, not speaking, just listening to the distant hum of city traffic and the untold stories resting quietly between us. Once, I asked him if he ever regretted keeping me here. Dominic looked at me for a long time, then said, "If I hadn't, I might have lost everything and never even known it." I laughed. Lost what, exactly? A clumsy, broke girl who talks too much? He didn't answer. He just pulled me into his arms, held me close, as if all the words in the world could never say it better. But the longer we stayed together, the more I came to understand one truth: Dominic hadn't completely let go of the old world. There were no more illegal deals, but the ghosts still lingered. Old debts unpaid, loyalties he hadn't broken, ties that wrapped around his ankles like vines, slow and steady, dragging him back to the edge. And eventually, I started to feel it too. The suffocation. One evening, after a successful art fundraiser, I watched him move through a crowd of investors. Calm, polished, every gesture perfect. To anyone else, he looked like a man who had it all, a patron of the arts, a refined businessman with a generous heart. But I knew better. I knew the price of that light was a constant, quiet war inside him. I couldn't walk beside him if he still kept one foot in the dark. I told him so that night, back at home, after dinner. Dominic was silent for a long time. "You want to leave?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I don't want to walk away, but I can't keep living only half of your life. I can't love a man who's always ready to disappear the moment the past catches up. I need to be more than someone you protect. I need to choose the path with you, not just follow behind it." He stood at the window, the city lights painting shadows across his face, drawing out every sharp, tired line. He nodded. "Then you'll have that. No conditions, no strings. You'll have full say over your own life. And if you still choose to stay once you're free to go, then I'll never question it again." I stepped closer, placed my hand over his heart. "I'm not staying because you made it impossible to leave. I'm staying because no matter where I go, my heart always finds its way back here." Dominic took my hand, held it gently, and pressed his forehead to mine. And in that moment between shadow and light, between old wounds and fragile hope, we both knew what we had found. A love that didn't need to be perfect, just real, and brave enough to survive even in a world that may never be ready for it. The exhibition opened on a mild spring afternoon. The sky was clear, the sunlight gentle, and the city streets more vibrant than usual. In front of the gallery stretched a long line of guests, journalists, collectors, and even young art students. Above the entrance, newly mounted signage bore the name Gallery Monroe and Callahan, bold in its simplicity and solid in its presence, like a quiet declaration that everything had truly begun anew. Dominic stood beside me in a perfectly tailored gray suit. He wore no watch, carried no phone, his gaze entirely focused on the space before him. This was no longer a place to hide anything. There were no more ghosts lingering behind the canvases, no more pasts sealed behind white walls and ceiling lights. The paintings on display this time were all originals, with verifiable provenance, carefully curated from hundreds of independent artists across the country. It had taken us nearly a year to complete all the legal procedures, finalize the financial records, and bring full transparency to the previous operations of the Callahan Gallery, separating it entirely from the networks that once moved in the shadows. Olivia had been the strongest supporter of this transformation. She didn't leave the gallery but stepped back, letting me take the lead, while she focused on building a foundation to support emerging artists. During the opening, she stood at the end of the guest line, didn't speak, didn't pose for photos, but I saw her smile when Dominic gave my hand a small squeeze as we cut the ceremonial ribbon. Dominic said little that evening. He let me take the stage to speak on behalf of the organizing team. I stood in front of the room, surrounded by the first collection I had curated with every fiber of my being. I told a story about a young art history student, once mistaken for someone else, once bound in darkness, who through that mistake found a path she had never imagined. No one in the audience knew I was speaking about myself. No one knew that the man standing beside me had once been a name on a federal watch list. And no one knew how many hard choices, sleepless nights, and moments standing at the edge of giving up it had taken to reach this night. After the opening, Dominic took me home. He didn't speak much on the drive, just held my hand tightly, as if afraid that letting go would make everything disappear. When we entered the apartment, I saw my mother sitting on the sofa. She had arrived earlier than expected, a neatly wrapped gift in her hands, and a look in her eyes that was equal parts cautious and uncertain. Dominic hesitated, just for a second, but I squeezed his hand and stepped forward. My mother rose and looked at him for a long time. There was no warm embrace, but neither was there rejection. Only the gaze of a mother trying to understand why her daughter had chosen to stay with this man. Dominic didn't try to explain. He simply bowed his head, quiet and respectful. She sat down, and the conversation began with small questions about the gallery, about work, about the upcoming exhibitions. But through the course of the evening, I realized the most important thing had already happened without anyone needing to say it aloud. The silence between Dominic and my mother was no longer a wall. It was a bridge, fragile, yes, but real. When my mother left, she turned to me, took my hand, and whispered, "If you're truly happy, I'll do my best to believe in your choice." I stood on the balcony, looking down at the city, my fingers still laced with Dominic's. No one was being held anymore. No one was mistaken for someone else. All that remained was a gallery, a light that still shone in the crowded city streets, and two people who had learned how to love despite the darkness that had once shadowed every step of the road they'd taken to reach each other. 3 weeks after the opening night, on what seemed like just another quiet Monday morning, I received a letter with no return address. It had been left on the gallery's reception desk, tucked beneath a brochure from the recently concluded exhibition. A plain white envelope, nothing unusual at first glance, but the moment I picked it up, a strange chill ran down my spine. I opened it in my office, where the angled morning light through the window cast shadows across each line of neatly typed text. "They're coming. And this time, they won't need a reason to knock." Below the sentence was a familiar symbol, a small circle with a diagonal slash through it, the old insignia once used in Navarro's organization. I didn't need anyone to explain it to me. This wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, and the beginning of something Dominic had been trying to prevent for years. I left the gallery immediately and called a car to take me straight to the apartment. Dominic was home. His shirt was half-buttoned, phone still in his hand mid-conversation. I didn't have to say much. The moment he saw the envelope and the symbol, his eyes darkened. "It started," he said, like he had known it would, just not when. I sat down, feeling as if every carefully built layer of protection around our new life had suddenly turned paper thin. Dominic called Olivia. His voice was low, clipped. She arrived within half an hour, carrying a thick folder and a USB drive with backup data. In the familiar kitchen, the three of us sat around the table just like the strategy meetings from the past, only this time, no one wore bulletproof vests or hid behind sunglasses. Dominic explained it simply. Navarro wasn't acting alone anymore. Since his release from prison, he had been rallying the remnants of the old network, convincing them Dominic had betrayed their agreements, sold them out, and rebuilt his success on the ruins of their past. For Navarro, the gallery wasn't the target, it was the symbol. If he could bring Dominic down legally, in broad daylight, it would be a total victory. And me? The girl once mistaken for someone else, once detained, then kept, and eventually chosen I was, now the weak link he could exploit. Less than 24 hours later, I received a subpoena from the federal government, not to investigate Dominic but to testify as a witness in a new case, this time targeting an international organization connected to both Dominic's past and the transactions once made through the gallery. I had the right to refuse. I could stay silent and let a lawyer speak on my behalf, but I also knew that if I didn't step forward, someone else would. And when that happened, the story would no longer be mine to tell. Dominic said nothing when I held the letter in my hand, but his eyes said everything. If I testified, I could save him or destroy everything. If I stayed silent, I might protect him but betray the very principles we had fought to build together. That night, I stood alone in the gallery. The paintings around me felt like silent witnesses, reminding me of every step we had taken. From a dark van to a cabin in the woods. From the panic of being mistaken for someone else, to the quiet nights building a gallery meant to exist fully in the light. I had lived too long in the shadows to now turn my back on the truth, and I had loved too deeply to let go easily. For the first time in my life, I found myself standing between two lines, honesty and loyalty. But I also knew this at some point. We can't hide behind love forever. Someone has to speak. And this time, that someone is me. I returned home just before dawn. The city outside still glittered with light, but it had lost all its usual energy. Only a suffocating stillness remained, mirroring my own state of mind. Dominic was sitting in the living room. The lights were off, save for a soft yellow glow from the kitchen that cast half of his face in light, the other half in shadow. He didn't ask what I'd told the FBI. He didn't ask what I was going to do next. He just looked up, eyes steady. But with the quiet resignation of someone who knew some things were now out of his control. I sat across from him, fingers clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. "Dominic," I said, voice calm but firm, "I need you to really listen this time. If we're going to keep going, if you still want to hold on to anything between us and this gallery, then I have to be the one setting the terms. No resistance. No rebuttal." Dominic simply nodded. "Say it," he replied. I took a deep breath. First, no more ties to the past. No more phone calls. No secret meetings. No intermediaries entering our lives without me knowing about them. Everything murky ends now. Dominic nodded again. "Agreed. Keep going." "Second," I continued, "I want all documentation tied to your old financial dealings handed over to a neutral lawyer. Not to turn into the government, but to protect us if this ever goes public. We can't stay on the defensive forever." Dominic was silent for a few seconds, then spoke, voice rough. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I believe in choosing again. But to be allowed to choose again, you have to take responsibility for what's already been done." Dominic bowed his head, fists clenched. "Third," I went on, "I want the power to decide when and how to cooperate with the FBI. I won't do it behind your back, but you don't get to interfere. If the time comes to speak, I'll be the one on that witness stand. Not to accuse, but to end it all." Dominic stood, walking toward the window. The streetlights lit his silhouette on the wooden floor. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "And if I say no?" I stood and moved beside him. "Then the Dominic Callahan I chose to love no longer exists, and Hannah Monroe will no longer stay." Dominic exhaled slowly. Then he turned to face me, took my hand in his, and pressed his forehead to mine. He didn't say he loved me, but the faint tremble in his hands, and the quiet, wet glint in his eyes said it all. "You'll have everything you asked for," he said softly. "But remember, if we do this, there's no going back." "I don't want to go back," I answered. "I want to move forward, whether it leads into the light or over the edge." Dominic smiled. A real smile, rare, fragile, like a sliver of sun breaking through a winter sky. "Then from now on we live by your rules." I nodded. "My rules, but built with your hands too." He placed one hand over my heart, then the other over his own. "We started with a mistake," he said. "But you know, sometimes the only way to find where you truly belong is by getting lost first." I didn't reply. I just held him, tightly, as if letting go would make everything disappear. But this time, I wasn't the girl dragged into a world she didn't understand. I was the one writing the rules. And Dominic, the man who once terrified me most, was now the one who trusted me more than anyone else. In a world where trust is a luxury, maybe that, above all, is the final redemption. 2 years later, the Monroe and Callahan Gallery was no longer just an art venue, it had become a symbol of something much deeper. It stood as the result of difficult choices, of rebirth from darkness, of a love that seemed to begin with a mistake but ultimately brought two people to exactly where they belonged. I still remember that afternoon, when Dominic knelt in the middle of the empty exhibition hall, no flowers, no music, just him and me, and a simple question. "Will you walk with me from here on out? This time on the path we choose for ourselves?" I nodded without hesitation, not because the past had been erased, but because the future was being built with truth and trust. We were married in a small ceremony, just family, a few close friends, and a vow that neither of us would ever again live in the shadow of anyone else. Dominic officially stepped away from all business tied to the old network. He transitioned into art consulting and began teaching business classes to young artists. Olivia continued to manage the support fund, and I became the lead curator for our annual exhibition series. Looking back, I often think of that winter afternoon when I woke up in the back of a dark van, hands tied, blindfolded, and completely unaware of what was happening. What felt like a terrible mistake at the time turned out to be a turning point of fate. If I hadn't been mistakenly taken that day, I might never have met Dominic. If Dominic hadn't kept me, he might never have faced the need for real change. And if we hadn't gone through pain, betrayal, and internal battles, maybe we never would have reached the kind of love that transcended the boundaries of right and wrong. Life sometimes throws us into situations that seem absurd, full of contradictions, but it's precisely in those moments when everything feels out of control that we're tested. To truly know who we are, what we want, and whether we have the courage to choose. That is the deepest human message this story leaves behind. No one is perfect, but everyone deserves the chance to choose again. And when that choice is rooted in truth, trust, and genuine love, then even a mistake can be the right one. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of today's story on Dear Single Mom. If you felt this story touched something inside you, something that made you pause and reflect, please consider sharing it. Hit subscribe, like, and share this video so we can continue spreading emotional, human, and inspiring stories to more people every day. What did you think about today's story? Did it remind you of yourself or someone you once knew? Leave a comment below and share what you feel deep down in your heart. We truly look forward to listening, to connecting, and walking alongside you through every storytelling video. Wishing all of you watching today good health, a joyful heart, and a peaceful, fulfilled life every day. See you in the next video on Dear Single Mom. Goodbye.